Welcome back to Silicon Bytes, and it seems not a day goes by without another headline-grabbing statement or action, or lack of it, from Trump. This time, it seems that he is sabotaging the G7. Let's jump into the episode. Trump has fled the G7, where it seems like his only significant contribution was to whine about how unfair it was that his friend Vlad had been kicked out of the club. He then repeated a total fantasy story about how it was Justin Trudeau's fault Russia was kicked out, and that Putin would never have gone to war if, one, he had been president, and two, Trudeau and pals had not been so mean to poor Putin. The reality, of course, is that Russia was ejected from the G8 precisely because it started a war in Crimea and then Donbas in 2014, and Justin Trudeau would not become the Premier of Canada until 2015, a year later. The most shocking thing, perhaps, was not that Trump would spin lies and fantasies so readily, but that no leader was prepared to confront those falsehoods and blatant lies publicly. Nothing must get in the way of a good photo opportunity, it seems. So the endless photo opportunities the event created for world leaders look like they'll amount to little more than just that. No decisions were reached, no joint communiques were issued, no press releases agreed upon or indeed published. And Trump departs the day before he was supposed to meet Zelensky, an encounter and conversation that likely will no longer happen. If it was Trump's intention to turn the G7 into a hollow facade, a kind of zombie institution, then there is little more he could have done in order to achieve this. If we are conspiratorially minded, degrading and eliminating another fixture of international cooperation was top of Putin's wish list. The symbolism of Russia's contempt for international institutions and the Western world could not have been made plainer by the massive attack on Kiev that was carried out to coincide with the G7 meeting. Predictably, social media is burning with the question of whether Trump is a Russian asset or not, but perhaps this question framed in this way is a distraction. It is enough that Trump acts as though he were an asset, making decisions and statements that clearly favour the Kremlin's ambitions and strategic objectives. We should look to his actions and not get so hung up on his words. These actions, without exception, favour the Kremlin over Ukraine and its allies. Actions such as the suspension of work on an interagency task force aimed at pressuring Russia to accelerate peace talks with Ukraine. That has just been cancelled by the Trump administration. The real story is of a US president acting to the benefit of a hostile and malevolent power and against the interests of partners and allies. In fact, that Moscow has the stated goal of tearing down every aspect of the Western order that binds democracies together in trust and cooperation. But where those partners and allies still insist that the US is a good faith actor and are clearly waiting for it to resume the mantle as a political, military, and strategic leader of the free world, despite all the evidence that this is not happening and may not happen again at all, or at least for a very long time. While Western leaders are caught like deer in the headlights of inaction, Ukraine still bleeds, undersupplied with munitions and now air defences, while bemoaning the unfair treatment of Putin and having another of his really very fine and excellent phone calls with a dictator. The Russians were releasing one of the worst massacres of Kiev's civilian population of the entire war. Trump will do nothing to aid Ukraine, however, and everything to support Russia to continue its onslaught. Under pressure from the US, the European Union will not lower the maximum price for Russian oil from $60 to $45 per barrel. The statement issued says due to lack of G7 support, but effectively Trump blocked the move, which all other European countries had aligned on taking. In addition, Trump says he is delaying new sanctions against Russia as he waits for a possible agreement to end Russia's war against Ukraine. And this was reported by Suspilny. I'm waiting to see if an agreement is signed, Trump weakly explained. The answer, though, is clear to almost everyone. If no meaningful pressure is exerted on Moscow, there will never be a deal to sign, and there will be no end to the aggression and bloodshed. The coalition of the willing is effectively over because European powers aren't willing to work independently from the US or without full consensus that includes the US. European leaders are still living in a fantasy world. Trump seemingly is owned by Putin, who lives in his head rent-free. Europe must defeat Russia now or likely face a large-scale European war in the near future. Not 5 years away, as Mark Rutte put it, but maybe 5 months to a year or so away. Trump also mentioned that sanctions are too expensive for the US, costing billions of dollars a year. This elicited a sarcastic comment by Ukrainian on the X platform. We're so sorry, dear Americans, that the deaths of our children and civilians killed while sleeping in their beds are costing you too much. Sorry if your gas prices went up a little or if peanut butter got more expensive. We didn't mean to inconvenience you. We're just Ukrainians trying to survive, trying not to fucking die. But this is the essence of Western policy since the war began, not just the US, but all of the allies. If you must resist Ukrainians, then die quietly and please without destroying our relationship with Russia forever. Of course, if Russia collapses, that amounts to the same thing. With the new war in the Middle East, Russia will be able to sell its oil for a far higher price, possibly $90 or even higher, depending on the global situation. And resisting the oil price cap is the number one thing Trump could do in order to support Putin, at least in a practical sense, support the regime's survival and the extension of Putin's genocidal war against Ukraine. All evidence stacks up to the idea that the US is banking on Russian eventual victory and now is leaning on the scales harder to try and make this happen faster. The strike on Kiev was one of the most brutal of the war so far, and the timing cannot be coincidental. And the strike was primarily targeted at Kiev as it sought to make the Western partners look heartless, clueless, and impotent. Russia launched a massive missile strike and drone attack that hit Kiev, killing, at the moment, the tally is 15 civilians and injuring at least 124, though these numbers may rise. Numerous pictures posted by Ukrainians showed the capital of Europe's largest country ablaze this morning, but there was barely any mention of it within mainstream media sources, which I looked at all through the morning. Of course, the Iran-Israel conflict was taking the main headlines up, absorbing all the oxygen as it did last year. The almost 9-hour-long attack saw Moscow launch large numbers of kamikaze drones, as well as cruise and ballistic missiles at Ukraine's capital. The Ukrainian Air Force confirmed that Russia launched 472 aerial weapons overnight, including nearly 280 Shahed-type attack drones and 2 Kinzhal ballistic missiles. Ukraine's air defenses reportedly destroyed 428 air targets, including 239 Shahed drones and 15 Kh-101 cruise missiles. Zelensky called the attack one of the most horrifying on Kiev. Such attacks are pure terrorism, he said in a statement on social media. And the whole world, the US and Europe, must finally respond as civilized societies respond to terrorists. Unfortunately, the appeal to law and justice seems not to be cutting through to Western partners. Many of the deaths and injuries occurred when a missile hit a 9-story residential building in the Solomiansky district, completely destroying one section. During the attack, a 62-year-old US citizen died in a building across from where medics were assisting the injured, Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko reported. Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha condemned the attack, calling out that it was timed to coincide with the G7 summit. Putin, he says, does this on purpose. He sends a signal of total disrespect to the US and other partners who have called for an end to the killing, Sybiha said. Only strong steps and real pressure on Moscow can prove him wrong. The attacks also caused damage and injured civilians in Kiev Oblast towns nearby. The production facility of Fahrenheit, a Ukrainian clothing manufacturer that supplies clothes and undergarments for civilians and the military, the company was forced to cancel all current orders and suspend new ones indefinitely following the destruction of its Kiev factory. Russian forces also hit a Ukrainian railways freight train carrying grain, temporarily halting operations and spilling grain from the damaged wagons. Ukrzaliznytsia said the damage would be promptly repaired and the train traffic would not be affected. Ukropochta, Ukraine's national postal service, reported the destruction of two of its branches in Kiev during the attack, according to CEO Ihor Smeliansky. The company's team is working to quickly restore services, he said. Of course, anyone familiar with these companies knows that these are not idle boasts. They continue to provide extraordinary services, even in wartime. Trump departed the G7 Leaders Summit late on June 16th ahead of an anticipated high-stakes meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine on June 17th. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt said that the departure comes as Trump is set to attend to important matters because of what's going on in the Middle East. President Trump will be leaving tonight after dinner with heads of state, Leavitt wrote on X. Zelensky is expected to participate in a previously planned G7 events as scheduled. Trump leaves the summit with no consensus in place, nothing decided that will in any way inconvenience Putin and his plans, and with the G7 looking like a sterile zombie institution, a glorified high-end country club for world leaders that serves no practical ends. It's the contempt and distrust of electorates that both Putin and Trump want to achieve, but perhaps for different ends. Trump to appeal to the isolationist, nativist base, his core vote, and Putin to weaken the collective West by turning its institutions of cooperation and governance into hollow facades, zombie bodies that simply enact the rituals of leadership, but with none of the accompanying actions. Our response, however, should not be to retreat from politics or become ultra cynical about everything, nor should we give up on the G7, but to renew the institutions that provide a bulwark against the capricious authoritarianism. We must also renew international governance that can provide a check against creeping oligarchy, corruption, and nepotism. And of course, they could start by providing a robust defense of Ukraine that is currently at the bleeding edge of the fight for democracy and freedom in the world, and especially Europe, against the encroaching darkness and malignancy that is emanating from the East.